السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يهدي فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. قال الله تعالى: يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. وقال تعالى: يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. وقال تعالى: يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة يفقهوا قولي. بسم الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran: وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ هَدَى اللَّهُ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ حَقَّ عَلَيْهِ الضَّلَالَةُ فَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الْمُكَذِّبِينَ. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the prophets and the messengers that He sent upon the people repeatedly. And many of those prophets appear both in the Bible and in the Hebrew Bible. For example, Musa or Moses, Dawood or David, Sulaiman or Solomon, Ibrahim or Abraham. Those are just a few of them. But in Islam, we also recognize all of the prophets that Sayyidina Muhammad, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent on all of mankind. And as He said in the previous ayah, which I just recited, He said, indeed, we've sent a messenger to every nation, so therefore every nation that He sent to has received that message of Islam. But in the Quran, we also have prophets that are not mentioned in the Bible. And of those prophets, we have Sayyidina Salah alayhi salam. He was not mentioned not only once in the Quran, but multiple times. And for a good reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just mention him for a couple of times just for the sake of us memorizing his story, but for us to learn from his story. Sayyidina Salih alayhi salam should therefore be regarded as important, and his story should be regarded as an important story in relation to our lives today. Prophet Salih alayhi salam lived in a land several hundred kilometers north of Yathrib, or modern day Medina. Right? And this area from where he was from, according to the Quran, was very rich and very fertile. So the land that he was from, many of the people were wealthy because of how fertile the land was, because of how they were able to trade and such. But of course, wealth and money comes at a cost, because for many individuals, that wealth and money takes a toll on their moral and ethical stature, right? So eventually they begin to let go of things that naturally would be a human characteristic. For example, they were arrogant, they were vain, they believed that they were above everyone else just because of their wealth. They were stubborn, they didn't like anybody talking to them because they felt everybody else besides them were lower than them. And they were above them. They treated the poor and the disadvantaged horribly. They didn't care about them. And their only worry was about themselves. And on top of that, they worshipped multiple gods. Right? So Sayyidina Salih alayhi salam was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was sending a message through Sayyidina Salih. And Sayyidina Salih's message, if we look at it, it really doesn't seem that hard. It's really not difficult. It's a very simple message. And it doesn't complicate things at all. What was his message? His message was that they practice worshiping one God and that they actually treat people like human beings and not like animals or lower than that, right? So their akhlaq or their manners would be adjusted so that they can actually emulate what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted for His people, for the Muslimin, for whoever received His message to follow, right? But Thamud were the people of which Sayyidina Salih alayhi salam was addressing. Thamud was that tribe. They didn't get it, and they didn't want anything to do with Sayyidina Salih's message or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quotes them saying, قُلْ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّي الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ وَلَا إِثْمَ وَالْبَغْيَ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ وَإِن تُشْرِكُوا بِاللَّهِ مَا لَمْ يُنَزِّلَ بِهِ سُلْطَانًا وَأَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تعلمون وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ أَجَلٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ أَجْلُهُمْ لَا يَسْتَأْخِرُونَ سَاعَةً وَلَا يَسْتَقْدِمُونَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quoted Sayyidina Salih alayhi salam talking to Thamud, and he said, Allah has made you a successor after Ad. Okay? Now Ad was a tribe before that, were a group of people that came before Salih. Right? And yet that was the warning. Okay? They were a group of people that didn't follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's message. And they were dealt with accordingly. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dealt with them accordingly to how they mistreated their messenger. So this was a warning that Sayyidina Salih was telling them, don't follow what Ad did. Don't follow what Ad did. And keep in mind that the wealth that you have, that everything that you have currently comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? All of this wealth, all of this fertile land, it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, if you are to let it go, if you are to ignore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have none of this. You are nothing. You are nothing without Him. You know what the response was to this? After refuting every single possible point that Sayyidina Salih brought up, including the fact that every single ounce of their wealth came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what was their response? They said, you're just a human being like the rest of us. You know, you're bewitched. Something's wrong with you. You're different. You have like magic or something like that. That was their excuse. They chose to ignore him. And if this wasn't enough for them, they demanded that if Sayyidina Salih was actually a prophet, that he performed some sort of miracle. So there was a rock, and they pointed to the rock and they said, if you're a prophet, turn that rock into a camel. They thought it was a joke. They thought they were laughing. Sayyidina Salih looked at the rock, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turned that rock into a she-camel. Right? And the she-camel was pregnant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then sent the ayah down which said that this camel was to drink from the well of that town, of Thamud's well, one day, and then everybody else would drink from the other day. Right? That was the command. That was a test for their people. Because what they said was, if you can turn that camel, we'll believe in you. They didn't think he would do it, but he did it. So now they were stuck with this camel. Now imagine you're sitting there and you're watching this happen. You're talking to some guy and he's saying that he's a prophet. And then you say, okay, if you're a prophet, turn that rock into a camel. And he just turns the rock into a camel. What do you do then? What is your reaction? So these people were in this thought process, and they were thinking, and they witnessed this entire event transpire. Right? So they saw this rock turn into a camel. And then on top of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to test them, tells them, you are to drink from this well one day. Right? So one day the well is dedicated, all the water in the town is dedicated to this camel. The rest, the next day, is dedicated to everybody else. Right? They didn't like this at all. They didn't like this one bit. They didn't like the fact that rock turned into a camel. They didn't like the fact that they couldn't drink every day. So what did they do? They devised a plan to kill the camel. But in order for them to kill the camel, they couldn't say it was from one group of people, right? So they decided as an entire tribe, right? An entire home, an entire group of people, that they would kill that camel together. Right? So they sent one person. They sent one person. That person was named Qitar bin Salaf bin Junda. And he was set to kill this camel. Keep in mind, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the people, you are not to harm this camel under any circumstance. If you even make the intention of harming the camel, be very careful. He was not joking around. He was very serious, right? He was very serious when he said that. And Sayyidina Salih was very serious when he said that. He said, don't kill the camel. You have one job: do not kill the camel. And they decided to kill the camel. What was interesting about this was that when they killed the camel, Sayyidina Salih was so upset. He said, why would you do? I told you not to kill the camel, and what did you go and do? You killed the camel. Do you not know what's going to happen with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Do you not know what He's going to do with you? Do you know what they said? They said, bring us this punishment from Allah. I dare you to punish me. They said, I dare you to punish me. On top of everything that they just did, they ignored Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They failed this test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On top of that, they were so arrogant that they decided to challenge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's authority. So what do we take from this? Right? From this story immediately, that Thamud ultimately disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger by committing the sin of killing this camel. And which that camel was a sign for them. They hastened their punishment, and ultimately they deserved their punishment. Right? Because they even asked for the punishment. They even said, give me the punishment. I dare you, I want to see what kind of punishment you're going to give me. Because they really didn't believe Him. And then after that, they rejected the messenger. They rejected the messenger who produced the unquestionable evidence for them. Now, don't get me wrong, there were some of people of Thamud who did convert and did follow Sayyidina Salih. But the majority of them chose this path. And it has been narrated that Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ said to Ali radiallahu anhu, shall I tell you about the most wretched of people? Sayyidina Ali replied, Qul ya Rasulullah. Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ then said, two men. One of them is the man of Thamud who killed the she-camel. This guy is getting quoted by Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ as one of the most wretched people in history. One of the most wretched people in history. Out of all the people who ever lived up until that point, he said it was one of them was the man of Thamud who killed the she-camel. And that alone should resonate, and that alone should represent how serious Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was with His message to that qawm. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم ومن والاه. أما بعد. So why did I mention the story of Salah today? Alayhi salam. The story of Salah is actually an important story in the Quran, right? And we can see evidence at the fact that it's important because of the amount of times it has been mentioned. So what is its connection to us? Right? How does this relate to us today? Because this happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. Right? It happened a very long time ago. So how does that relate to us today? Well, first and foremost, right, it teaches us what? It teaches us that we should not put God's might, we should not put God's power to the test, ever. Right? Don't dare Allah. That's not a good idea. Right? And these people were so arrogant that they asked for their punishment. They wanted to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could do to them. So that's the first thing. Right? The second thing it teaches us is to never disobey Allah or His messenger. Therefore, if our messenger says something, we must follow it and we must never object to it. سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. Right? We hear and we obey. Therefore, Sayyidina Muhammad said to, for example, he said to pray 5 times a day. We must pray 5 times a day. We cannot object to that because Sayyidina Muhammad instructed us to do so. We can't sit there and try to mock him because that just wouldn't make sense. These two are obvious conclusions of the story, right? So these are the literal conclusions. If you look at it more in depth, however, there's more to the story than you think. For example, what are the 5 pillars of Islam? Right? Fasting, praying, the shahada, going to Hajj, making zakat. Those are the 5 pillars of Islam. Right? These are considered fard upon us, or obligatory. Right? Every Muslim must do this. Right? Must complete those 5 pillars. However, how many times do we hear the fard, do we hear that something is obligatory or highly recommended, and we set it off? I'll give you an example. And this is, I'm not hating on everybody here. Alhamdulillah, everybody comes to Salah. I'm very happy. But for men, it is obligatory or is highly recommended for you to pray Jama'ah in the masjid whenever possible. Right? The exception is that there is no masjid near you, so you pray Jama'ah with your group of people. But if there is a masjid near you, every single man must go to that masjid and they have to pray. That's wajib, right? You have to do that. But how many of us are in the situation where we can go to the masjid, but we just don't go to the masjid? We'll either pray at home or whatever public place that we're in, just because we're too lazy to go to the masjid. Like we really don't feel like it. We'll put that off, right? How many of us just go to the masjid on Friday prayers, or just go to the masjid during Ramadan, right? We're just like you punch in, you punch out, that sort of thing. Our duty to Allah is to follow what His Messenger has told us to do. Right? Yet how many of us follow the Sunnah exactly? Many of us don't. So in this regard, we agree with Allah when things are good, right? When we have that consistent flow of wealth. You saw with Thamud, they were completely fine. They had all the money in the world. They were okay. And then as soon as Sayyidina Salih came along and said, listen, you gotta let go of your wealth. You gotta be nicer to people. You have to do some things. However basic, like the things that he said were basic. We see them as very, like this is obvious. But for them, that was huge for them to do. Right? And even when they heard that, they were like, no, I'm not gonna do that. It's too much effort for me to do that. Too much of a compromise. So in this sense that we should when we hear the call to prayer, we should go to the masjid. Or when we hear something in the sunnah, right? That has been verified, we should follow that. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands for us to do something, we should follow what He says. Right? And we should follow exactly what sami'na wa ata'na really means. Another thing is that you think how many times we've pleaded, right? We've begged Allah for example, you're about to take a test, you haven't studied the night before, or you felt like you haven't studied enough for the night before, huge midterm, this is a third of your grade, and you pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives you 100, right? And you pray, to the point where the night before, you feel fairly confident that if you go into that test tomorrow, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make that test magical, and it'll just like fly off your desk and go to the teacher's hands and just be 100. Just like in the ladder, the magic carpet. But then we don't get what we want. Instead of 100, we'll get like a 76 or an 80 or something below that, right? And immediately when we hear that, we're so mad, we're so angry, and we're like, how is this even possible? I prayed like 5 hours. After you studied for 1 hour. So what do you expect from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So in that sense that we shouldn't forget that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to help you to a certain point, and the other point is that you should take that initiative. Or in another sense, we promise that if we'll get 100 on the test, that we'll fast for 3 days. Or I swear Allah, if I get 100 on this next test, I'll donate my first check for work, or I'll do such and such thing, and we don't do it, and we just set it off. Subhanallah. This is what Thamud did. This is what Thamud did with Sayyidina Salih. When they saw that camel, they said, okay, we'll follow you. 3 seconds, like a couple of days later, they killed the camel. right? And then they asked them, they begged them to punish them. So we should take this example of Thamud. We should take this example of how they acted towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how they acted towards their messenger. And we should put it into our lives. So in regards to the basic things that they did, such as disobeying Allah, or promising something and not fulfilling it, or lying to each other, those are the things that we should take away. Those are the things that we should avoid committing at all. There's a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeated the story over and over again. And here I mentioned it very briefly. I tried to water the story down as much as possible. But if you do have the time to take the story and to read through it, there is a whole, you can keep reading it and you'll find different messages in it.